שיש בהם יראת שמיים ויראת חטא חיים.
On the registration form, he had to put where he came from, where he was born, who his parents were, and his wife, and where he lived, and if he had any children, and he certainly crossed out, this was the registration sheet on arrival to Buchenwald. He put that he had no children, presumably because he didn't want me discovered, at that time, and it was an attempt to save me. But anyhow, just to see on black and white his name and his signature that he was in this horrible camp, I think that was, that was another hard kind of moment. My name is Judy Drache. I was the hidden child, if you like, but I kind of remained hidden for the rest of my life almost. The big issue of my life is, of course, not just that my parents and my family were killed in the way in which they were killed merely for who they are, but the fact that I could have found out what happened, I could have found out who I was. I was torn away from my roots, if you like. My father was clearly, I don't know how religious he was, but he was very much involved in maintaining a Jewish home and a Jewish life, and through his work he was doing the same. I was, and it must have been a terrible decision on their part when they were deported to hand me over to a cousin of my mother's, because they didn't know for sure if I would survive or not. Apparently my father wrote a letter to me at that time, which I found once when I was maybe 12 years old, when I was still living in Hungary, but put it back. It was hidden away in my stepmother's drawers because I was adopted by this cousin. And I think, but I don't know for a fact, that it was this cousin that I was handed over to at the last minute before my parents were actually deported. But she was completely unwilling and unable to tell me anything at all about my parents, about being Jewish. I was not brought up as a Jew. Of course, in Hungary at the time, it was also not particularly de rigueur, to be religious anyhow. Before the war, in the late 30s, my mother and my later stepmother, and at some point my father, who got to know my mother in around about 1936, but they didn't get married until 1942. They all were a group who, it appears, did a lot of things that young people would have done at the time, or probably do now. Walked in the hills around Budapest. I know that my mother was quite sporty, my real mother, and I heard later on also from other family members that my father and my mother, my real mother, were Zionists, and that was quite uncommon in Hungary at that time. If my father hadn't actually worked for the Jewish Museum, as he did during the war, and there wouldn't be evidence of the work that he had done, and if he hadn't published academic articles and hadn't done some of this academic work, of course I wouldn't know very much about him. So in addition to the personal recollections, of people who knew him, which was very few, I started this research very late, and unfortunately I missed a lot of people. It's a postcard that my mother wrote to an aunt of hers during the war in 1944, just maybe 2 or 3 weeks before they were deported, talking about hoping that, you know, what terrible lives, what terrible times we are living in, but we have to still hope, you know, that the dear God will somehow help us out. And by the way, you know, little Judy is developing well, and she can say certain words, you know, like Dada and Papa and goodbye and that sort of thing, and what a nice child she is, and all the rest of it. So, so I mentioned in her postcard, and yeah, that is definitely it's the only personal link, I suppose, that I have to my mother. Because she wasn't, you know, wasn't an academic or anything, didn't leave anything else behind. If she did, it's lost. It's gone with the wind. So he had been doing a lot of work where they sent him out to these other places, but he was also doing a lot of administrative work within the Jewish Museum, as I discovered eventually when I worked in the archives there. There were 2 letters and a postcard which he wrote, the first one in April of 1944, the next one in May of 1944, and the postcard also in May, the middle of May, and he was writing back to the person that was the executive director of the museum at the time, and who had been one of his professors at the rabbinical school, to thank him for whatever he has been able to do for him, while he is now basically locked down in his home, in his house, in the outskirts of Budapest, from where he was eventually deported. From the middle of May to the end of June, when the deportations came to that part of Budapest that he was living in, he was not able to go out, not able to go to work anymore, but he was still mindful in the letter, for instance, of a couple of projects that he had been working on, and was telling the professor, okay, I'm sending back the keys with such and such a person to you, and the material relating to an exhibition that they had just worked on, you can find them in such and such a drawer, you know, in such and such a room in a cupboard. But in a way, he's also asking for help. He's asking for whatever they might be able to do for him. And apparently the professor tried to send him some kind of a laissez-passer so that he could get out of the house and go into Budapest. But apparently that never happened anymore after the middle of May. My parents, 3 of my grandparents, that is my paternal grandparents and my maternal grandmother and other members of the family, were deported because they mostly lived in one part of Budapest, which unfortunately was in that zone which was deported, because the Jews of Budapest were in the end not deported. And so there's a lot of unfortunate kind of ifs, what if that hadn't happened. They were deported on one of the very last trains from a place called Újpest, which is on the outskirts of Budapest, to Auschwitz. They were, first of all, they were picked up, collected with about 14,000 people who lived, Jews, who were in that part of Budapest where they lived, were sent to a couple of collection places from where they would be put on trains. They were in something like a brickyard for 2 or 3 days, presumably without food, without water, and without washing facilities, all the rest of it. People were brutalized in those places because the Hungarian gendarmes, who were cooperating completely with the German, the Nazis, who ordered the deportation of the Jews, they tried to get away the last bits of valuables from people, so people were beaten and people were questioned. I found out from my stepmother's mother, the one I in my childhood called grandmother, that my mother was actually pregnant when she was deported. I don't know how far along, but in any case, I suspect she might have been with, you know, her mother and the other grandparents, so they might have just died there. I found out much, much later on, when I first found a friend of my father's in Israel, that my father, in fact, didn't die in Auschwitz, but was transferred with a couple of thousand other Hungarian Jews to one of the subcamps of Buchenwald. Now, I found this out first from a man called Tzvi Kedmi, whom I met in Israel on my first trip to Israel in 1990, and I was searching around for people who had known my father or my parents, and I found this man through the advice of one of the rabbis that I knew anyhow. So he was the first one to mention to me a camp called Reimsdorf, which is where he said he and my father had been sent to work from Auschwitz. When they were called up, they went. Of course, some people were called up for work in Auschwitz and then were sent to the gas chambers. So, I mean, one had to make choices that we can't imagine, I suppose. I have some sheets of the registration of my father in Buchenwald. So they arrived in Auschwitz. They were in the middle of July, well, around maybe the 10th of July. They were on one of the very last trains, after which the deportations were stopped in Hungary, but they were one of the very last trains in around the 8th or the 10th or so of July. Arrived after a few days to Auschwitz, and within a week they were in Buchenwald. In this registration form in Buchenwald, asking about where the father and the mother, their names and where they live and where the wife, if you had one, or the spouse was living. My father put down at the moment in concentration camp Auschwitz. That was their address, and yeah, that too is something that's unimaginable, really, when you think about it. In Buchenwald, they were put into a subcamp which wasn't even ready as a camp. They had to build, apparently, there was a camp with tents. They had to actually build the wooden structures in which they were going to live. And the section that he went to is in a place called Reimsdorf or Zeitz, very close to Weimar, the cultural center of Germany for 200 years. And I studied German literature, and I have to say, I always, I mean, I get tears in my eyes when I think that my father was sent to within a few miles of that place, and what a terrible, awful situation they were in. When he filled in the forms on arrival in Buchenwald, they asked, among other things, for your occupation. He put down archaeologist, which to me seems such an outrageously ironic thing to put down, and of what earthly use could that be to somebody in a concentration camp or a labor camp or a death camp? It's basically what it was. They were worked to death. But I don't know if it was for that reason that he ended up in this particular company that he was put into. It was called Kommando Wille, named after the person who was in charge of it was called Wille. They worked in brown coal and petroleum soil. They were basically digging and mining because the Germans were looking for fuel for continuing their war effort, basically last minute, even though it was clear to everybody that the war was lost. It seems that my father survived until pretty much the very end, that is, until the camp was liberated by the Americans in April, or very close to that, just before that, when the Germans, when the camp was being dissolved and people were either left there simply to die or transferred to other places or force marched to other nearby camps further into Germany, actually, where there was still, because of course by now the Russians were coming from the east and the Americans and the British were nearby, and it was the Americans who liberated the camp at the beginning of April. But by that time, apparently, according to Zvi Kedmi's telling of the story, they had been put on a train. He wasn't sure to where. He ended up in Theresienstadt at the end of that train journey. But at the very beginning, the train was bombed by the Allies. It's also ironic that, you know, they didn't bomb Auschwitz, but they did bomb the Jews that were put on trains to be moved out of danger. In any case, but Zvi didn't know if my father died there or even before. He really wasn't sure, and I've looked around at all kinds of places. My father is not listed as having died in Buchenwald. Buchenwald keeps a list of the people that died there, and I haven't been able to find anywhere else any mark. There's a book that somebody published, local history book, in which some Hungarian Jews who died in the vicinity are named, and because they were buried there, but he's not listed anywhere. So I actually don't know exactly what happened to him at the end. Mr. Kedmi, Zvi Kedmi, put in his Yad Vashem sheet that he submitted, he just put he was shot on the way, but it doesn't say, you know, there's kind of a half a line, I don't know on what way. But he told me that he still remembers seeing my father around the time when they were put on the train, but he didn't see him afterwards. And at that time, my father told him that I had been left in the care of this cousin, and he also told him that there was a letter that he'd written to me and he wanted to repeat it, and there was a letter and a ring, actually his wedding ring or my mother's wedding ring, I don't know, in which he expressed his wish that I should be brought up as a Jew. And Zvi Kedmi always felt, until the moment that I've met him in 1990, he had a bad conscience about the fact that in fact he hadn't. They tried, apparently. They tried to get me from Budapest, and I have letters that were exchanged between him and his wife's father, who was still in Budapest, who had gone to all kinds of trouble to see if they could get me away from the situation that I was in and take me to Israel on one of the transports of children, surviving orphans. Another man whom I met several years later, absolutely by chance, because I saw an article of his in a book on a trip to Israel, and who mentioned my father by name among the 6 students of the seminary who were Zionists, and he had been one, and my father. So when through the Kedmis, I found this, I figured this man must have known my father, and indeed he did. And by this time he was very old and ill, and I went back to meet him before he died with my 2 daughters, and he said, I'm telling this story because this is, I think, when I actually realized what it all meant, and said to my daughters, I knew your grandfather, he was my best friend, and I did everything I could to try to save him, but unfortunately it didn't work. And what he tried to do to save him is, apparently he went out twice to visit my father and his family, to try to convince my father to get on a so-called Kastner train, which you may have heard of from other sources. This was a train that eventually left Hungary through negotiation with the Nazis, with about 1,600 Hungarian Jews. That's when I think we all burst into tears, you know, when he started saying that, because that's when you realized, and he told us a lot about my father and how they were just like ordinary people. They didn't want to be, you know, want to wear black hats and become rabbis, but they missed some classes in order to go to the cinema and that sort of thing. I delayed a little bit too long. I learned a little bit from my grandmother's sister. When I was a child, I knew of this letter which explained that my parents were, you know, my father's letter to me. I didn't undertake any research then. I mean, I was too young. I didn't really, and plus I just soon after that we left Hungary because there was the Hungarian Revolution, 1956. We left and we moved to England. I had to learn English. I went to school, went to university. Then I came here to continue my studies. I got married, I had children, and there were all kinds of reasons for which somehow I put it off. I read little bits. I read about the history of the Holocaust, but I didn't directly try to find out. And I didn't really try to find out until 1980 when I first went back to Hungary. And I thought, okay, now is the time. I've got to speak to some people. And I had very little family. I had one cousin who was actually a cousin of my mother's, so 20 years older than I am. And I met with him when I went back to Hungary. And he was the first one who told me that my father had gone to the rabbinical seminary and had a dissertation, and I should go and talk to the professor at the seminary, which I did. And then I came back in 1982 and I started some research then. And it sort of went on from there because I got names of people. It wasn't so important for me to do genealogical research. You know, I did a bit of that too, but that's not what I was after. I was after the people that I didn't know and should have known, you know, all my life. So that's sort of when it started, and I think it progressed. I have to say, I remarried. My first husband and I divorced, and I married somebody who was a Jew. My first husband wasn't Jewish, and that made a big difference also to be in a more Jewish environment and situation. And I feel personally, through my father's publications and through whatever I found out, I feel that I have a connection. I have some kind of a personal connection to what I didn't know when I was a child and what I could have had when I was a child but didn't. I was the hidden child, if you like, but I kind of remained hidden for the rest of my life almost. It's almost as if we have been telling largely the story of my parents or other family members, but in a way my story, I guess, is that I lost all that, you know, but that I found some of it. I mean, it's a story of a search, which we didn't really talk about the details, but there are some interesting little bits and pieces to it, as to how I found somebody or how I spoke to somebody and neither of us knew who the other was, and you know, we kind of went by each other and I could have found out something but didn't. So there are many aspects like that, but in the final analysis, I mean, I think I have my daughters and my grandchildren for whom I think this is or will be, for the younger ones, at some point, I hope, very meaningful, the same way that it's been meaningful to me. It's very important. Of course, it's important for me personally, and that's what we've been talking about, and for my family. It's important for my children because, you know, they missed having grandparents and they want to understand their own life and their own situation better. It seems there still are people who don't believe that these horrible things could happen, and yet they happen even today in all kinds of situations. Hatred, anti-Semitism still exists, and I think it's, on the one hand, it's very important for there to be some mark, some trace, if you like, of people to whom this happened, mainly so that people can understand also that it's not for any other reason except of people's maybe religion or people's skin color or whatever other reason. It all doesn't make sense when you think about it. So I think it's very important that we know the truth about the past.